On the 7th of September, 1533, in the lavish rooms of Greenwich Palace, a cry rang out that would change the course of history. But at that moment, the king didn't hear a triumph, he heard a disappointment. Henry VIII had torn England away from the Catholic Church and discarded his first wife, all for the promise of a son. What he received instead was Elizabeth, the daughter of the infamous Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth arrived into a world that didn't yet know how to value her. To the public, she was a symbol of her mother's witchcraft to her father. She was a reminder of a failed prophecy. But Elizabeth was a survivor from her first breath. She was born into the center of a storm that would eventually claim her mother's life and leave Elizabeth a pawn in a very dangerous game. This is where the legend of the Virgin Queen truly begins, not with power, but with the precariousness of a girl whose existence was a scandal in itself. The first true trauma of Elizabeth's life arrived when she was just 2 years old. In a world of shifting political alliances and a king's volatile heart, her mother, Anne Boleyn, was arrested and executed for adultery. Imagine the confusion of a toddler suddenly stripped of a mother and a title. Labeled a bastard by the very man who had once worshipped her mother, Elizabeth was pushed to the periphery of the court. But she was not entirely forgotten. Henry's last wife, Catherine Parr, became the stabilizing force the young girl so desperately needed. Catherine was a woman of intellect and grace, and she ensured that Elizabeth received an education that rivaled any prince in Europe. Under Parr's guidance, Elizabeth became highly educated, learning to speak several languages fluently, a weapon of intellect she would later use to outmaneuver the most powerful men in the world. She was being groomed for a throne she wasn't supposed to inherit. When Henry VIII finally died in 1547, the crown passed to Elizabeth's young half-brother, Edward VI. At just 9 years old, Edward became the boy king, and Elizabeth moved into the household of the widowed Catherine Parr. It was a time of relative peace, but in the Tudor world, peace is always a fragile illusion. As Elizabeth watched her brother rule, she saw the pressures of a divided England. Edward was a staunch Protestant, and his reign pushed the country further away from the old faith. But Edward's health was as fragile as his youth. In 1553, at just 15, the boy king died, leaving a power vacuum that would ignite a sisterly rivalry the likes of which England had never seen. Suddenly, the bastard girl of Greenwich was no longer a side note. She was a threat to the next person in line. With Edward's death, the crown passed to Elizabeth's older half-sister. Mary was a woman fueled by a different kind of fire. A devout Catholic, she was determined to return England to the Roman faith at any cost. For Mary, Elizabeth was more than just a sibling. She was a Protestant rival and a symbol of their father's betrayal of Mary's own mother, Catherine of Aragon. The tension between the sisters was lethal. Because Elizabeth was Protestant, Mary viewed her with deep suspicion. When a rebellion broke out, Mary seized the opportunity to neutralize the threat. Elizabeth was arrested and imprisoned in the Tower of London, the very place where her mother had spent her final days before the axe fell. Elizabeth walked through those gates, not knowing if she would ever walk out, proving that in the game of crowns, blood is rarely thicker than belief. For months, Elizabeth lived in the shadow of the executioner's block, watching from her windows in the tower as Mary's reign became synonymous with the fires of persecution. But fortune is a fickle mistress. In 1558, Mary died from illness, And the impossible happened. Elizabeth, the girl who had been declared illegitimate and imprisoned as a traitor, was now the successor to the throne. At the age of 25, Elizabeth I became the Queen of England. She inherited a kingdom that was bankrupt, religiously divided, and surrounded by enemies. But Elizabeth had learned the art of survival in the Tower. She knew that to rule, she had to be more than a queen. She had to be a master of compromise. Her first act was to return England to Protestantism, developing the Church of England, but she was clever enough to maintain certain Catholic elements, like the crucifix, to appease the traditionalists. She was walking a religious tightrope, and the world was waiting for her to fall. Elizabeth knew she couldn't rule alone, and she quickly assembled a circle of advisors that would become the envy of Europe. At the head of this Privy Council was William Cecil, Lord Burleigh, her trusted Secretary of State. Cecil was the anchor to her ship, the man who understood the mechanics of power as well as she did. But a queen also needs eyes and ears in the shadows. She appointed Sir Francis Walsingham to be in charge of gathering intelligence, essentially creating one of the world's first sophisticated spy networks. Alongside them were Nicholas Bacon and Nicholas Throckmorton, her ambassador to France. These men were experienced and trustworthy, but they all wanted the same thing for their queen or husband. They saw her as a woman who needed a man's guidance, but Elizabeth was already proving that she had the heart and stomach of a king. Presiding over all of this was a figure few Elizabethans would have recognized. Streaked with white and red makeup, resembled nothing so much as Heath Ledger's Joker, or perhaps his copycat grandmother. If you look at her portraits, she was portrayed as regal and wealthy, fashionable, but her actual features look normal and intelligent. Much of the modern distaste for her look has more to do with modern distaste for Elizabethan standards of beauty. Who among us, after all, would dare wear a bumroll than Elizabeth I herself? While her council pushed for a political marriage, Elizabeth's heart appeared to be focused elsewhere. One advisor, Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, was notoriously close to the Queen. Rumours swirled through the corridors of the palace that Dudley was more than just a friend. He was a romantic interest, the one man who might actually capture the Virgin Queen's hand. The scandal of their relationship was the gossip of every court in Europe. Dudley was handsome, ambitious, and deeply devoted to Elizabeth, but his presence was a political nightmare. He was already married, and when his wife died, under mysterious circumstances, falling down a flight of stairs, the suspicion of murder clung to him like a shroud. Elizabeth was caught between her personal desire and her public duty. She knew that marrying Dudley could ignite a civil war. And so, once again, the survivor in her won out. She chose the crown over the man. The pressure to marry was relentless. Parliament was insistent that Elizabeth continue the Tudor dynasty with an heir. They presented her with courtships from the most powerful kings and princes in the world, fearing that without a husband, England would be vulnerable to invasion. But Elizabeth's answer was always a variation of the same defiant theme. She declined marriage, famously stating to an insistent Parliament that the welfare of her country was her primary priority. She didn't see herself as a woman in need of a king. She saw herself as a monarch married to her nation. By remaining the Virgin Queen, she kept the powers of Europe at bay, using the promise of her hand as a diplomatic tool without ever actually giving it away. It was the ultimate power play, ensuring that no man, foreign or domestic, could ever claim her throne as his own. Under Elizabeth's steady hand, England didn't just survive, it flourished. Her reign saw a golden age of progress that brought wealth and prestige to a country that had once been on the brink of ruin. Trade expanded rapidly, and the spirit of exploration took hold of the English imagination. In 1580, Francis Drake became the first Englishman to successfully circumnavigate the earth, bringing back riches and glory. 5 years later, Sir Walter Raleigh formed a colony on the east coast of North America, naming it Virginia in honor of his Virgin Queen. This wasn't just about maps. It was about establishing England as a global powerhouse. While the explorers claimed the seas, the arts flourished at home. This was the era of music, poetry, and the birth of modern theatre, led by playwrights like William Shakespeare. The unwanted daughter had turned England into a cultural and economic titan, but even a golden age has its shadows. Elizabeth's biggest challenge would come from her own family tree, her cousin, Mary, Queen of Scots. Mary was everything Elizabeth was, not a Catholic, a woman who had been married multiple times, and a queen who had produced a male heir. To many Catholics, Mary was the rightful Queen of England, making her a constant threat to Elizabeth's throne. Elizabeth kept Mary imprisoned for years, trying to avoid the scandal of killing a fellow sovereign. But Mary became the center of a web of conspiracies. Elizabeth's spy master, Walsingham, used his surveillance network to uncover a plot to overthrow Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. After years of hesitation, Elizabeth was forced to act. In 1587, Mary, Queen of Scots, was tried for treason and executed. It was a move that secured Elizabeth's throne, but it also invited the wrath of the Catholic world. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, was the final straw for the Catholic King Philip II of Spain. In 1588, he launched a massive invasion force, the Spanish Armada, to remove Elizabeth and restore Catholicism to England. It was the greatest threat England had ever faced. A fleet of ships that seemed invincible, the Virgin Queen in the end had defeated the greatest empire on earth, cementing her status as a legendary ruler. As the 17th century dawned, the sun began to set on the Tudor dynasty. Elizabeth had outlived her friends, Erebos, and the men who had once tried to control her. On the 24th of March, Ichen Leobalingsan, at Richmond Palace, Elizabeth, I breathe her last. She was 69 years old, an incredible age for a monarch of her time. Because she had never married or produced an heir, the Tudor dynasty died with her. In a finale, ironic twist of fate, she was succeeded by the Protestant James VI of Scotland, the son of the very cousin she had executed. Mary, Queen of Scots. The depiction of Queen Elizabeth I as grotesque in modern media and later historical portraits is a deliberate intersection of propaganda, toxic beauty standards, and cinematic subversion. While she was the most powerful woman of her era, her visual legacy is defined by a clash between the mask of youth she demanded and the harsh physical reality of her aging. Elizabeth I had begun her life as a scandal and an afterthought, but she ended it as the architect of a New England. She proved that a woman's heart and stomach could indeed rule a kingdom, leaving behind a legacy that still fascinates the world today.